Hey everybody, I thought I would record the notes for our last class in case you missed it or you needed a refresher because I know that shutter speed can be kind of confusing. So let's go ahead and get started. This is just a quick review that we've reviewed every week, but I want to make sure you completely understand it. When you're on the green button, that's in auto and your camera controls everything. It's really no different than the iPhone, quite honestly, and the only reason things look different is because of your lens. Here in portrait and landscape and the little running man, the little flower, you're still in auto. You're just giving your camera a hint of what you want it to look like, but you have absolutely no control. So I say never use that again. That would be my advice. Then we get into semi-automatic, or not, semi-manual. And this is where we're giving the camera one of the settings and then the camera's doing the rest. For instance, on here you have AV on Canon or A on everything else, and that's aperture priority. So you're setting the aperture and you're saying, hey, I want to shoot it really wide open or I want to shoot it really closed down. You're making the choice, and then the camera is doing the math on the rest of the exposure triangle. Same with TV, which is shutter priority on Canon and S on everything else. And you're setting the shutter and then the camera's doing the rest. And then over here in full manual, this is where you're controlling everything. And this can be a great way to shoot, but it takes a lot of practice before you become proficient. Now, one more review of the aperture shutter speed ISO, which is called the exposure triangle. And basically, it's a little math equation. So you can adjust any one of these items to get a proper exposure, but they're all going to give a different look to your picture. So remember that the shutter speed is the amount of time the shutter's open. So think of it like a curtain. The curtain's either opening and closing really quickly to let light into the room, or it's opening and keeping open for a long time to let more of the light flow into the room. And one way to think about that is think about it if it's really bright out and you're in your bedroom and it's bright outside, it's dark in your bedroom, and you just want to let a little bit of light in the room, you're going to open the curtain and shut it really quickly because otherwise the light's going to flood through the whole room. But say it's night outside and you want to let the moonlight into your room, you're going to need to open that curtain and leave it open to let more light come through into the room. And that's all the shutter's doing on your camera. In fact, I think it's even called a curtain, so you can think of it like a curtain. Now these are some pictures that I took at a concert and I wasn't paying attention to my settings, okay? And you can see that this is really, really bad. I've let too much light in. I've completely washed out my subject. These are pretty much unusable and unrecoverable, okay? So there's different ways that I could fix these pictures, and it really doesn't matter how. I could fix the shutter speed, I could fix the aperture, I could fix the ISO. So let's talk about this a little bit. So let's look at this one right here. There's way too much light. So one of the ways that I could reduce the amount of light is I could close down my aperture. So I could make the hole in my lens smaller. This means I make the number bigger. Okay, so that would block out some of the light. If I changed nothing else, I didn't change the ISO, I didn't change the shutter speed. By closing down my lens, I can let in less light and get a proper exposure. Okay, another way I can do that, depending on what my ISO is. If my ISO is super high, I don't know what it is in this case, but if it's really high, I could keep the ISO, or I could keep the aperture and the shutter exactly the same and just take my ISO down, because that would make my sensor less sensitive to light. It would let less light in, and I would get a better exposed picture. Or depending on what my shutter speed is, if my shutter speed is too low, say it's 1/50th of a second, I could increase my shutter speed and block out some of the light, let less light in, and I wouldn't change my aperture and I wouldn't change my ISO. So there's, each one has a different effect on the picture. If I change my aperture, I may be getting more or less in focus than I want. If I change my shutter speed, I might be affecting the LED screens back here. If I make the shutter speed too high, I might just start to see moire or patterns in the LED lights. Similar if you've ever taken a picture of your TV and gotten funky colors. So that might be a reason that I wouldn't change my shutter speed. And then on ISO, if I get my ISO too high, I start to get a really grainy, noisy picture. So there's reasons that you might change one of the three settings, but know that you can use any combination of those three to get the proper exposure. And then as the creator, you decide which way you want to do that once you get to manual. All right, so we're going to talk just about shutter speed today. And as I already explained, the shutter speed is the time that the shutter is open. A slower shutter speed produces blur, so motion blur, and it lets in more ambient light. What is ambient light? Ambient light is the light that's already existing. So say you're in a room and there's a lamp on the table. If you use a really fast shutter speed, it might get rid of all that lamp light. But if you use a slow shutter speed, it's going to let more light in and it's going to show the lamp better. Maybe a better example of this is a Christmas tree. If you use a fast shutter speed, you're just going to get little dots of light. It's not very, it's not as nice of a look as if you use a slower shutter speed and let all those lights on the Christmas tree kind of pop out more. So just know that ambient light is the light that's already existing in the scene. Now a faster shutter speed, this I think is more easy to picture. It produces very sharp pictures. Think of sports pictures. Say you're watching PGA golf and they hit their shot and then all of a sudden you hear like the shutters of the cameras going really, really fast. That's freezing the motion. And so that's really important mostly well, it's important all the time, but it's very important in most sports pictures to freeze the action. It also doesn't let light in. So here's an example of water. A slow shutter speed produces milky flowing water, like a waterfall, and I have an example I'm going to show you. A fast shutter speed freezes the water, makes it look crisp, clear, it stops any motion, any water droplets, etc. Now here is a picture, and originally I wanted to show you a perfect picture, but then I thought, you know what, sometimes you can learn more from imperfect pictures because I can show you something. So here I'm trying to freeze the action. You can see his face is very sharp. His eyes are sharp. His body's sharp. The water is very sharp. You can see the droplets are all frozen here. This was taken indoors at the Cumming Aquatic Center. As you can see, I used 1/640th of a second, which is pretty fast. But you can notice his hand. His hand is moving very quickly. And you can see that there is some motion blur here. So if I wanted to freeze that action, I want a higher shutter speed, probably more like 1/1000th. Okay, so, but I wouldn't say this is a terrible picture because I did really isolate him and get him in focus, and this shows that his hand is moving quickly. So depending on if you want to show some motion or you don't, you can adjust that shutter speed. But this is an example of when you're using shutter speed to freeze the action. Now here, I can't show you this on the video because of copyright, but if you want to go to Google and Google Jeremy Cowart, he's one of my favorite photographers. He's a humanitarian. He's also very artistic, does some cool creative stuff. And look up the Resilient Light series and look under the images and you'll see all these really neat photos, and this is very, very, very advanced. Like I really don't even, I'm not even sure I completely understand how he did this. I kind of do. But he was shooting in the pitch black. He's got some behind the scenes on his video, and this was actually the middle of the night. They couldn't see what they were doing, and they were just painting with light. And this is actually painted. It's not a Photoshop written thing, and these are the reflections of that in the water. This is a series he did for hurricane victims to raise money for them and kind of bring something beautiful to the misery. So if you're interested in that, take a look, but that'll really show you an example of painting light. There's similar and easier things you can do if you look up just painting light in Google or Pinterest, and there's lots of fun things you can try. Here, this is one of my favorite sports photography books. by Bob Martin. The book is called 1/1000th, and 1/1000th is the shutter speed that you typically want to shoot sports, at least, to freeze the action. But this is an effect called panning. And what you do is you slow your shutter speed down and then you follow the action with your camera, and it freezes the subject, but then it turns the background into kind of a motion blur, which makes it feel like this biker is going really, really fast. And it's a lot, so it kind of brings motion and movement to a still picture. And that's something you can do by manipulating your shutter speed. So, and if you Google Bob Martin and look under images, you'll see a lot of his different images. They're really cool. Now here's an image I took at a waterfall in North Carolina, and you can see that I've got a really small aperture, little tiny hole, and I've opened my shutter speed up to be very slow. And what that allows this to do, I would never be able to handhold this, so I set it on a little pillar. I can't think of the word. I just set it on something solid, and I use my self-timer. And then what that does is it gives you the flowing water. Instead of freezing the water, you can really tell that that's a flowing waterfall. And so that's something else you can do with shutter speed. Slow it down and show flowing water. Now here, if you click in your notes here, this is from Pinterest. I did not take this photo, but this is the difference when you freeze the action with your shutter speed or you slow it down. So you can really kind of show movement. Think of a race car. They use this a lot to show the wheels moving, the background blurred, because they don't want it to look like it's a race car sitting in a parking lot. They want to show that it's a race car moving along the track. And this is how you kind of create motion in a still picture. So if you remember from our aperture lesson over here, this is one picture. And the only thing that they're changing is the shutter speed, okay? They're slowing down the shutter speed, but they're not changing the aperture and they're not changing the ISO. And so this is the effect that it has on the photo itself. So here we've got 1/125. The photo is a little dark. We continue to slow down the shutter, 1/100th, lets in more light, 1/80th, lets in more light, 1/60th, lets in more light. And you keep going down until ultimately the picture has so much light in it that you've lost detail. So you just have to determine where the ultimate exposure is. And here, when you're setting the shutter speed, the camera will do the rest for you. It will determine the aperture. And I've been having you set your ISO because we don't want really the camera controlling that, because you want to control the amount of grain and noise in your photo. Now this is an actual assignment from one of my first classes from one of my students, and I thought it was a great example and something you can do at home. So you can see all this is something set under the faucet in the kitchen, and they slowed down the shutter speed. And you can see the water is very flowing and smooth. It lets in a lot of light. And then they made the shutter speed faster, and now it's underexposed because we've blocked out the light, but also notice the droplets of water are frozen. So you can see the effect of, if you don't change anything else, you just make your shutter faster, what it does. It blocks out the light and it freezes the action. So this is a great example and something that you could easily try at home. Now here's an example from a corporate job that I did. This was some people playing the drums, and it doesn't look all that interesting. It just looks like they're drumming here, drumming there, drumming everywhere. And here, if I click, what was actually happening is the drums were spinning. So they weren't playing a still drum, they were playing spinning drums, which is a lot more impressive. So you can see I went from 1/250th of a second on the shutter speed here, which froze the action, down to 1/80th of a second, which allowed, I can still get the subjects in focus if I hold really still, but it shows more of the motion of the spinning drum and is much more impressive than just kind of hitting a still drum. So I hope that makes sense. It kind of gives motion to the picture. It shows that they're actually doing something much more complicated than what appeared in the first picture. This is a photo I took at a triathlon. And this is a panning, not quite as impressive as the one I showed you by the Olympic photographer, but what I did was I followed this guy and I slowed my shutter down enough that the background is blurry. And look at his wheels. These, you can't read, oh shoot, sorry. You can't read the zip very well here. So you know these wheels are spinning, but the felt on his bike is very clear. The 27 here is very clear. So you want your subject in focus, your background looks like it's rushing by, and you want your wheels to look like they're spinning. That's how you create movement in a panning shot. Here, I was in New York City under the Freedom Tower, and I was up on a ledge, and I slowed my shutter way down, and I put it on something solid. And you can see I'm at f22, so I'm getting everything from here all the way to the back in focus. Everything's in focus. My ISO is very low because I'm going to slow my shutter speed way, way, way down so that this creates motion and movement. You can tell all these people are walking. It looks busy. So it creates a scene where there's lots of people, everybody's moving, everybody's on the go, and that's kind of how you create that feeling in a still photo. Here I'm walking on the New York City skyline. Again, I'm at f22, and this is, I'm letting in more light. It's a darker scene, so my ISO is up to 1600, and I've got it setting on a ledge again. My shutter speed's at 2 seconds, so if you think about it, 1/1000, 2/1000, it's open quite a bit. And there's a few things going on here in this picture that you'll notice. One, everything from the front of the scene, from 10th Avenue to the sign here, all the way back here to the buildings in the back, everything's in focus. It's sharp from front to back, and that's because of the f22. Now you'll see I've got starburst. Anywhere there's light, I've got a starburst, and that's something that happens at higher apertures. So at f22, I'm getting starburst, and this little mess right here is a fingerprint on my lens, so ignore that. Here, these are the car lights moving. So the cars that are moving, you see just streaks of light. You can see people crossing the road here. They're streaks and ghosts. Over here, there's people walking. So anything that's moving is kind of a streak and a ghost. So it creates movement, and it gives you nice sparkly pictures. It really lets the light through in the back here. And yeah, so anyway, sorry, I keep getting messages popping up on my screen. Now here, this is the eclipse, obviously not the actual eclipse because it was covered by clouds, but this is right after the eclipse happened, and you can see that the moon is moving away, but here we've got the ISO is very high because we had a very dark filter to block out the sun on the camera, so you couldn't even see through it, so it essentially made your scene black. So we had to bump up our ISO really high. You can see it's up at 3200. We're using a really long lens, 300 millimeters. We're at a really small aperture, so it's closed really down to make sure that we get everything really sharp and in focus. And then our shutter speed is really long. It's open for a long time so that that light from the sun can get through the filter and to the sensor. So it's got to be open longer because the scene is so dark. All right, and so this is kind of the cool shot that we got right after the eclipse happened. Now here, this is up at the collection. I was doing a job, and you can see I'm on a tripod here, and I've got my ISO up at 2000 because I want to let as much light from the scene. You can see the uplights on the trees. You can see the little string lights in the background, plus the light on the tree. I want all that light to come through. And then I'm pretty wide, so my wide 35 millimeter, I can see the whole scene. F16, I'm stopped down because you can see I can see Chico's is in focus. I can see the manhole cover here is in focus. The leaves in the foreground are in focus. Everything's in focus from front to back. The only thing not in focus are the people moving. So I'm still going to get motion blur even though I have a really large depth of field. So don't confuse motion blur with depth of field focus. They're two different things, and I hope that makes sense. And you can see I've slowed my shutter speed really slow here because I want all these lights to really pop out and be sparkly in my picture. And I want to show all the uplights and the store windows, so that's why I slow my shutter speed way down to let all this light in. This is my front yard. For graduation, we put string lights back and forth between all the trees, and it was pitch black out. And so what I did was my ISO is up pretty high because I'm going to let all this light from the scene, the street lights, our house lights. You can see we've got some house lights up in the trees here. And then I want all the string lights to be really sparkly. So the reason they're all little starbursts is because I'm at f14. Remember, anything above probably f7 will start to give you these starbursts. And then I'm at a 4-second shutter speed. So think about this: 1 1000, 2 1000, 3 1000, 4 1000. I have the camera on my front deck. My hands are not on it, and I've got it on self timer because otherwise it would be blurry. So I've got a tack sharp picture, and I wanted it at f14 because I wanted these cool sparkles, starbursts, okay? So I specifically chose this aperture, and my shutter speed is really slow so that I can let all this ambient light. Here's a great example of ambient light. Ambient light is light already in the scene. So my house lights, the street lights, that's all, these lights, that's all ambient light, okay? And then I'm just letting more of that light absorb onto the sensor to give me a really cool picture. So tips and tricks. If you're shooting children or anything moving, pets, I would say no lower than 1/125. But quite honestly, you're probably going to need to get up to 1/200th of a second or even higher if you have a shaky hand. So anything moving, make sure that you're getting a decent shutter speed and that you're zooming in on the back of your camera. If you don't know how to zoom in on the picture on the back of your camera, look it up on your manual. We did this in class. But you want to zoom in because sometimes on that little 3-inch LED screen, it looks like a great picture, but when you zoom in on the eye or the hands or the feet, you can see that it's actually blurry. So you want to make sure that you're checking on the camera before you get it home on your computer and then realize all your shots are out of focus, because that would suck. Now sports, ideally, you're going to want 1/1000th, but that's not always possible, especially in indoor sports or under the Friday night lights. So you're going to want to aim for 1/500th. All those swimming shots that you saw were shot at 1/640th. So 1/500 and 1/640th are usually okay in terms of stopping the action, but you may see extremities like hands and feet that are blurry if they're moving fast enough. And you saw that in my picture of his hand being blurry. When I took some football photos, I also saw feet blurry when they were running, even though their bodies and everything were in focus. So sometimes you just have to deal with it because you may not have enough light in the scene to get all the way up to 1/1000th. This is typically not an issue whatsoever in outdoor daytime sports. You might have to watch it at dusk or if it's super cloudy out. Long exposures. You need to use a tripod and a self-timer, or you need to put it on a table or a bench or all the things that I did on the pictures that I showed you. Otherwise, it's going to be out of focus. You're going to get a lot of motion blur. So that's really, really important to understand that. Otherwise, you're going to wonder why everything looks so blurry. And then I already mentioned this, to zoom in on the back of your camera to make sure your pictures are actually in focus. So we are not going to have class to look at your shutter speed, but I'd love for you to do your assignment, and it's similar to your shutter speed assignment, or I mean your aperture assignment, where you're just going to put it on shutter priority, and I want you to walk through all of the different shutter settings, so really slow to really fast, and look at the difference that it makes in terms of motion blur, letting light in, keeping light out, stopping motion, showing blur on purpose. There's different things that you can do. So if you want to use something at night, you can put your camera on a tripod or on your front deck, and you can slow down your shutter speed and capture cars going by and get the street lights streaking by. That's a fun thing to do and a good way to practice. And then you can also go out and shoot a pet running or a toddler running, or just get somebody to run around and try to stop the action and look at how what your shutter speed needs to be in order to get that sharp picture. I just want you to get an idea and get comfortable with all the different ways you can play with shutter speed. And like I said, if you go on Pinterest or YouTube, there's a lot of fun light painting activities and tutorials that you can do if you're interested in figuring out how to paint 4th of July with sparklers, or there's a fun, you can set fire to steel wool and spin it, and you can make spinning pictures. There's lots of cool things you can do out there, lots of creative people. With that, with that, I encourage you to follow my Pinterest board. I'm always putting tutorials out there as I find them. So that's a good way. And then if you haven't joined the Facebook group, it's a great place. You can put your assignment 3 pictures there and ask questions, and feel free to email me as well, because I am always here to help you. Thanks so much. Bye.